Welcome all. For those of you who haven't seen me before, my name is Billy Hollis, and I started out as a developer, first writing code for money in 1978. I always liked the user design side of things, but nobody would really pay me to do that until about 15 years ago. So I made the transition. I still do get involved in development. I still do write code, but my main activity for the last 12 to 15 years has been design. Have we reached the point now, I think we have, where most teams understand the importance of UX design now? But that doesn't necessarily mean that most teams know how to do it. And I get called in often when a team has experienced a design failure to try to get something back on track. So in this session, I'm going to tell you about some of the failures I've seen, not just my own, but that I've seen in the industry, and see if we can find some common themes to failure to help you recognize the possibility that you're going in the wrong direction and give you some advice on getting you onto the correct path. So teams are still figuring out how to do design, but let's be pretty blunt about this. Developers would prefer to be doing other things for the most part. In particular, they really like writing code. And as a result, they tend to give a less attention, less than they should, to some of the other aspects of development, like architecture and UX design. So I recognize that, but sometimes failure can be extraordinarily expensive. So I try to reorient developer psychology a little bit and help them get away from their focus on code, because one of the examples of a failed design project where things went really bad and they spent lots of money was the U.S. fighter program for the F-35. They spent $1 trillion on that program. Of course, a lot of it was manufacturing, etc. But at the end of the day, this article came out last year, the U.S. admits that it did not fulfill its needs, and they need a new fighter generation. In other words, the article admits that they expect to throw away that $1 trillion and start over. $1 trillion. What's the economy of Norway? The yearly economy. I'm thinking it's probably somewhere in that range. Oh, I thought I took that out. So architecture, fine. We know that we can. There are good resources to do architecture. I suggest that one. I put it in the slides. But what happened to the other problems? What were the other problems in this F-35 program? Well, one of them was poor UX design, which yielded catastrophic results. In this case, that's a quote from that article that I just showed you. The fighter jet suffers from a slightly embarrassing touchscreen problem. It turns out that touchscreens in the cockpit of a fighter jet weren't nearly as good an idea as they thought it was. That the pilots reported that an unfortunately high percentage of the time, they thought they engaged a switch, a button, slider, whatever, on the touchpad, but in fact they did not. Now, why did they go to touchscreens? Well, I can imagine the meeting, although the people in it probably weren't dressed as nicely as these people, but because they're government workers, but where they said, oh, touchscreens, smartphones, that's the future. So of course we would like to have programmable touchscreen buttons in our next generation fighter. We would be able to change out interfaces and do, well, that all sounds very cool, but it turns out that it was a disaster. Because if you put yourself in the mind of the user and you think about flying, some of you may be pilots, think about the experience of needing to turn something on or off. What are the disadvantages of a touchscreen? Well, number one, you have to look at it, as opposed to a physical switch, which you can feel tactilely while you're still looking outside the plane. Secondly, it gives no substantial feedback, tactile feedback, to let you know when it's on. You have to play sound, which might be missed, or the visual, or look at it again to make sure that it is in fact engaged. So, and you think about all the distractions and such that would get in the way about that, then it's pretty clear when you look at it that way that it was not a good fit for the situation. But they spent $1 trillion without ever asking the question of whether it was a good idea. What would happen in your applications if the user thought they'd entered an order, but the software didn't think it happened? You may have run into that. That would be considered a pretty major mistake in an application, would it not? Why did they do that? Well, as I said, I'm sure there are people sitting around in the room who thought it was just a cool thing. But when I teach design classes, one of the things that I tell the people I'm teaching design is that one of the most dangerous phrases in the whole industry is, wouldn't it be cool if? Every time you hear that, you ought to be thinking, oh, this might not be good. This is a red flag. Developers love cool technology, and so they have a natural affinity to go in that direction. They want to work with it. So in many cases, they lack skepticism about it. And that leads to things like the cockpit of the F-35, which has all these touch screens. And the end result was that one of the generals in charge of this project said, oh, I have to read this because you don't drive your Ferrari to work every day. You only drive it on Sundays. This is our high-end fighter. We want to make sure we don't use it all for the low-end fight. That's a general in a press conference, a quote. Now, suppose you wrote a massive next-generation app and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on it in your organization. And it was really cool. It used the latest, best technology, but it was so clunky for everyday tasks, important tasks, that the user preferred the old system. Are you going to go to your boss and say, well, this is the Ferrari level app. It's not intended for everyday use. How far are you going to get? So what should the F-35 team have done? Well, they should have had a world-class architect. They had a bloated code base, and it was very buggy, and that's one of the other issues with it. Now, I could talk all day about too much code and code bloat and bad architecture. I'm going to focus on design here, but I don't want to minimize those problems. They needed a world-class architect, but they also needed a world-class designer who could have figured out how to make do the political maneuverings to get some good design in. Somebody should have prevented the overuse of cool stuff and aim at the intended user. But this problem is not at all restricted to projects like this. I went into a failed project. They were replacing an AS400 system. And they had a modern web application, all the latest, nicest web stuff. But the bottom line was that system took longer to get an order entered than the AS400 system it replaced. Yes, the AS400 system was hard to learn. You had to memorize a lot of keys and things like that. But somebody that's sitting there whose income depends on getting these orders into the system isn't going to put up with slowing them down just because it looks better and it's cool and it's modern technology. They revolted, basically. Pounded on the table and demanded to go back to the AS400 system. And management gave in, threw away that web system, and started all over. Wasted all the money that they spent on it. That browser-based app was completely junked. Well, that's one example from my own experience of software that was created because it was supposed to be cool, supposed to be the most modern, cool stuff, but in fact didn't really meet the needs of the people it was aimed at. But it can get even worse. Sometimes there are failures because software is produced because it seems cool, and there isn't anybody that needs it or wants it. There never was. Here's the best example I know of that. You guys remember a product called Story Remix? Does that ring any bells for you? Probably not. Anybody use it? I don't see any hands. Well, it was important enough to be part of the keynote at Microsoft Build 2017. And understand that the Windows keynote at Build each year is supposed to highlight the most important innovations in Windows for that year. Well, let me show you something. Hang on. I'm going to show you a few seconds, about 20 seconds, of the video that was shown at the keynote. Let's find it. Is that it? That's it, isn't it? Yeah. Let's drag that over to where you can see it. Get it to full screen and play. This is the keynote, extracts from the keynote. Oh, we don't have sound, do we? Well, you can read the. It's kind of slow, but basically they're putting explosions into this film of a soccer game. So that when they kick the ball, it explodes, and and they were really, really proud of that too. Hang on, let me get back to the slides now. Of course, the problem going between monitors is getting your cursor right. In fact, I guess I should probably show you that that product is still buried in the Photos app today. How many of you knew that? Here, let me show you. I guess I'll put this over there so that you can see it. Where is my? There it is. So I have a little animation here. Some of you have seen these ideas of. Oh, I've got to move it from here to over there. Hang on. Come here. You ever seen these reloading animations? Where they show like games have reloading animations, and some people did some funny ones. So that's just the video that I'm going to use as an example is the biting reload animation here. All right, let's stop that. And it comes up in the Movies app by default, so I don't need that. What I need it to come up in is the Photos app, so I will do that. Right-click, open with Photos. Whoops, come here. And of course, I have to move it over to you, to the other monitor, because it comes up here. There we are. So here's the Photos app. I'll not make it full screen, so it'll be easy to kind of move around. That ought to be big enough for you to get the idea. Now, if we go up here and you look at Edit More, add, well, they've got it pretty well buried, don't they? Add 3D effects, then it opens up this editor that allows you to put explosions in, among other things. You didn't know you had that, did you? Here, let's go over about where I need the explosion to go when the bullet hits the wall. Come on, let's drag you over a bit. Somewhere right about there, if I get it right. And drag in an explosion, like where the bullet's going to hit. Okay. And now, play the thing, and now let's go back to the beginning so you can see the explosion happen. So, yeah, see it. Now my gun is firing explosions. Who needs that? Do any of you feel like you need that in your applications? So let's shut that down then. I never did actually see it from the beginning. The Photos is being, there we go, yeah, that's kind of from the beginning you see it. Because I could put in as many explosions as I want. Wow. Isn't that cool? Well, just think about how much money they spent developing that product. And nobody cares about it. You don't care about it. I don't care about it. They buried it. I'm sure there are some middle schoolers that care about it for their class videos or whatever. So, but they spent a whole lot of money and got really nothing of consequence out of it. So, explosions in videos, I just imagine the meeting where they said, oh yeah, it would be cool if we could embed explosions in the, and notice, by the way, that the explosion followed the soccer ball. Yeah, that's upsetting. You can say, I want it to follow this object on the screen. No, it was a complete waste. So that sort of thing happens quite a lot, and the most common scenario I see in business where people do things that they think are cool is when they move to new platforms and they don't really know yet what's useful and what's not. If you were in the XAML world, which I did a lot of WPF work, it was common about 10 years ago. People used to do a lot of page flipping animations because they could. But that was the sort of thing, the first time you saw it, you might think that's cool. By the third time, it's tedious. By the 10th time, you hate it. So you have to understand that that's one of the problems with cool, is that it ages very rapidly. You get tired of it quickly. True story. I was evaluating a WPF project that a client had done, and they got to a point. I'm watching them demo their app, and they got to a point where there was a page flipping animation. And I walked up to the front of the room and pointed and said, don't do that. That's not the funny part. The funny part is everybody in the room laughed except the president of the company because it was his idea. But he took it in good stead. But you want to look at places where you have massive failure because they tried too hard to be cool. Well, there's Windows 8. I hope by now we can come to a consensus. Some people liked Windows 8, and that's fine. You do enough interesting stuff, it will appeal to some people. But it was so reviled by the user population at large that, except for a few legacy products, it's not used at all today. They just kind of quickly went past it. And Windows 10 went back to what made Windows 7 useful and popular. And there were many, many obvious design mistakes. Jakob Nielsen, one of the foremost usability and UX guys in the world, summarized them publicly. I was trying to tell Microsoft privately, but they were just sure that they had it right. I'll tell you what happened there in a moment. So Windows 8 was a failure, but it was a preventable failure because the things they were doing wrong, the design principles and such, were obviously not good design to someone who was experienced in design, which the people at Microsoft were not. They were naive about it. So that's one of the dangers as you move a team into design. And many of the failures came about because Microsoft was scared at the time. Do you realize how scared they were around the Windows 8 era? The iPad came out and had this explosive growth. And Microsoft thought, oh, that's just going to take over the computing world. And Apple's going to push us out the way we pushed IBM out back in the early 90s. So they were scared. They were really wanting to take the iPad head on, and they thought the way to do it was to be even cooler than the iPad. But the problem with that, and you know this from high school. You know somebody probably in your high school class that so desperately wanted to be cool, and they did the dress and the affectations and such. Did they turn out to be cool? Most of them, no. Trying hard to be cool is not a particularly good way to be cool. You usually fail. So if you're trying to get people to look at you and see how cool you are, you're really, that's an indicator that you're going in the wrong direction, that you're trying too hard. If you wave a flag, look at me, I'm Windows 8, I'm cool, then you're probably going to not be cool, and you're just going to irritate people. I mean, I look at Windows 8, and look at those Power Ranger colors in the tiles and the sharp edges. Now, we get to Windows 11, they've rounded out the edges in their interface now. Because, and I was in the keynote for Windows 11 when they said this. They said, we find that, our user research says that's more approachable. People like it better. Well, why didn't you do that user research in 2011 for Windows 8? Because I could have told you then. It's a standard design principle called contour bias. that people perceive rounded things as safe and sharp things as having some level of danger, which there are places where you actually use that to accentuate the danger, but on a daily basis, something somebody's using all the time, that's not what you want to do. And then there were other design problems, this monstrosity right here. I'm going to talk in a minute about why they did this, but the design principle it violated is called Hick's law. The time to locate and use an option increases as the number of options increases. Trying to find your way through this, if it didn't have the little search thing up in the corner, it would have been so bad nobody would have used it, because you're just scanning through and they aren't well organized, and you don't have any control over how they're organized. Particularly, there are no folders. I'm going to tell you why in just a few minutes. But Hick's law is probably the design principle that more software development teams routinely violate than any other. You finish doing a feature, you got to hook it into the system somehow. You don't think much about that. You just go stick it on a list and a menu somewhere that's already too long. So Microsoft failed to understand that. Didn't they get user feedback to find some of these things out? Because I tried talking to some of the internal people and said, I don't think this is going to fly, and here's why. Oh, well, we have talked to the users. We have showed it to them, and they love it. Do they really? Because it's violating design principles. So, and it ultimately failed. So that suggests that maybe they talked to the wrong type of users or didn't know how to do it. One of the problems that you run into when you're trying to get feedback, I call the Clever Hans effect. How many of you are aware of Clever Hans, the horse that toured Europe 100 years ago? Yeah, there's a couple of hands there. So for the rest of you who don't know about Hans, he was a horse who could do arithmetic. You would ask him, Hans, what is 3 plus 5? And he would stamp 8 times. But somebody got suspicious and started checking to see what was going on. And after investigation, what they eventually discovered was that Hans was reading the audience's body language. When he began stamping after the question, people would tense just a little bit. Will he stamp enough times? And when he stamped the right number of times, there was a slight relaxation in the audience. And that's what Hans was picking up. Now, if a horse can do it, your users can read body language and understand what you want them to say. So you have to be very careful in getting user feedback that you are doing it in a neutral fashion. You wouldn't believe seeing me in some of these sessions getting user feedback, how flat my voice is and how utterly flat my body language is, because I'm trying hard not to let them know what I like in the design. And Microsoft clearly failed to do that. In defense of them, they were still very new and learning the design discipline, the techniques for doing things. They're somewhat better today, although they still have a ways to go. But they lacked one of the essential characteristics of learning to do design well, and that is humility. Microsoft is not known for having humble people working for them. Let's talk about some other bad approaches now that we've beaten up the whole cool thing enough. Assuming a design that works well in one place will work in another. That is a not uncommon problem. Copying designs without figuring out whether or not, if we got somebody that did that.
Oh, yes. Let's do it like Apple.
Let's do it like Apple, yeah.
Scrolling effect, parallax like Apple has.
Yes. That's one example. Copying something that you considered cool without consideration for whether it actually fits in the place that you're trying to put the design. And again, that comes from immaturity in design, not really understanding that most designs are created for a set of circumstances, and they might fit in other similar circumstances, but they aren't a universal solution to circumstances that are completely different. Let me tell you an example from my own experience. We did this app in 2008. This was the first really major XAML app that we did. And it was considered groundbreaking for the time. Remember, that's 14 years ago. Microsoft used it as their standard example for a business app. in WPF for several years. It was designed for salesmen in temporary staffing companies. And for those users, it was considered a great design and a big success. Well, you know 3M Company, right? The people that make Post-it notes and stuff like that. They have a healthcare division, and they copied this design. Actually, thousands of people copied it because Microsoft showed it to so many people. They copied this design for an application that was to help radiologists do radiology reports. That's about as far from a temporary staffing salesman in terms of user as you could get. And to their credit, they realized this isn't working. Let's call the people that did this and come in and design for us. And we did, in fact, design their radiology app around 2010, customized for those circumstances in that user. Notice, for starters, the dark theme. Where is a radiologist operating? In a room where he's got to look at images, including some of them on, in these light boxes and such. So that just one sample screen, and that's about the only sample screen you can find on the web, because they don't like showing the design. They don't want their competitor to steal it, because it was a huge success. We did something that was a major innovation. We didn't just copy other designs like their Windows Forms version. We questioned the assumptions too. We went, okay, we're in a new world now. Are there things we can put in our design that wouldn't have been possible in the old world? That's one of the reasons you don't just want to just slavishly copy old stuff. And in fact, the main thing was, you see the little picture there, that's sort of toward the bottom of that radiology report part. Up till then, radiology reports look like their ancestor, which was done on a Selectric typewriter. A lot of radiology reports were based on older systems like the AS400, and it was all just text, read or printed out. So they had an entire language to say, in the upper medial, that sort of thing, to indicate where on an image they were trying to comment. And then they would tell you what the problem was. So I asked the question in the definition meetings, is there any reason, instead of having all that verbiage to describe where this thing is, why couldn't you just grab out, most of the images are electronic now, so they're displayed on another monitor. Why can't we just get a little snapshot of what you're talking about, put it right inside the radiology report, and then go ahead and tell us what's wrong with it? You can put the upper medial whatever stuff too, that's fine. But people reading the report shouldn't have to be going back and forth with their eyes between the report and the image. And that idea caught on pretty fast. In fact, the first beta customer signed up specifically because of that feature. And they went to, I think, 400 million sales in the first 5 years that they put it out. They moved from being a second-tier unknown player to being one of the major players in that market. So don't copy old designs just because they're around. That's kind of lazy. And laziness in general is a bad design approach, but it's regrettably common. Some of you may have heard a while back, a couple of years ago, when everyone on the island of Hawaii was told that there were incoming nuclear missiles and to take shelter. Did you hear about that one? This is the screen where that drill was selected. And this is a HTML page. And the problem was that you've got the alert and you've got the drill for the alert that only goes out to the people who are being drilled. But they look almost the same. It isn't obvious which one, and somebody just picked the wrong one. But, I mean, how much thought went into designing this screen? None that I can detect, because even the verbiage is bad. The verbiage could be much improved. And I spent 5 minutes in Microsoft Word doing this, which could be dramatically improved too, but at least it would have made it much, much less likely, practically impossible, for somebody to select the real alert by accident. 5 minutes for me to do design, how long would it take one of you HTML people to implement it? I mean, I'm not very good at HTML, but I could do it in about 10 or 15 minutes. Take the old one and make it into this. Does this mean anything to you? It's a code thing. No? Well, it didn't mean anything to the security guard in the Notre Dame Cathedral when the sensor system gave an alert and said, this is what's wrong. So by the time they figured it out, the fire was out of control. So laziness is another, as I said, some of that goes back to the fact that you really rather be writing code. A theme that I will hit several times because I really need developers to understand. In this modern world, look, I know, software is extremely complex and everybody wants it out faster and it takes longer every year to get it out. And I understand the pressures that are on you. But when you use that as an excuse to create stuff that slows down users or induces them to make errors or burns down buildings, then you've kind of gone too far in concentrating on your code. But as a result of the fact that we are under a lot of these pressures and the fact that developers would rather be doing code, they tend to build what appeals to them. So for example, a lot of business apps have what is commonly known as the wall of data grids pattern, that they have main pages people use all day long, and it's nothing but like 3 data grids. The screen is sliced up into rectangles and a data grid's put in most of them. How many of you have apps with that pattern? Come on. See, I know that I should be seeing more than 10 hands, so I have to do my diagnostic routine. Some of you may have heard this. How many of you can put at least one hand over your head? Now, I will come into the audience and heal you if you have problems. Okay, so you can do it. Okay, so let me try again. How many of you have an app with the wall of data grids in some important screen? Okay, there you go. That's over half the audience now. And then we understand why people do that, right? It's another lazy approach, actually. You don't have to think much about how the users use the data to stick a data grid on the screen. It's basically the database throwing up on the screen. The schema just sort of... And people have to figure out how to use the data, and they can do that. That's why the data grid pattern does work at some level. But you're pushing the responsibility onto the user, thereby not worrying about how their job works at any level of detail. All you need to know is what they need to see, not how they use it. So, but data grids are rarely the most effective design pattern in modern apps because we have so many options. Still a viable way to do certain things, especially in financial industries, but they should not be used commonly. Appeals to us, exposing data needed by one user or a small number of users to all users. We have a screen. 5 of the 100 users need to see this piece of information. So we stick it on the screen for everybody, even though 95 people don't care about it. That's lazy development, but it appeals to us because we don't have to think very much about how do we make that only appear when it's needed. Forcing a browser-based app just to get easy deployment. I think the example I gave earlier of the people replacing the AS400, I asked them, well, why did you want a browser-based app? Well, it's easy deployment. Well, that's fine and all, as we say in the American South, but is the resulting app really the right fit for them? Now, they could probably have done a browser-based app. That would have been quite a lot better than the one they had. But if you're looking at things like trading apps, stock trading apps and things like that, they are almost never browser-based because native technologies are a better fit to get the kind of interaction patterns and response times that those apps demand. So I understand a lot of business apps are browser-based and it gets better every year. But doing it just because we don't want to take the time to figure out a good deployment pattern is not a particularly good approach. if you do some stuff and the users don't like it much, but the response is the users just need more training on that. No, good designs don't need much training. True story, actually, from that staffing app I showed earlier for temporary staffing. The app it replaced required a week of training. I took that training, and I didn't understand anything about the app when I was done. And so when we pushed it out to our first beta customer, we scheduled some training. It was online because they were in another city. We sent them credentials a couple of days ahead of time. So we logged on and said, okay, we're ready to do some training. And they said, well, we don't think we need any. We have these 5 questions about the app we'd like to ask. The app was intuitive enough that they just used it. And almost exactly the same thing happened with that radiology app. They cut the training for the radiologists from a week to a day. And understand these are very high-paid professionals. And the training was reoriented to just give them tasks and have them do things in the software, do those tasks. And then if they got stuck, help them out. There wasn't any formal lecture training about things, maybe 10 minutes at the beginning. So that is achievable, even for complex things like generating radiology reports. That's achievable with good design. But if you just do what you want to do, and well, I want to talk about another failed approach here in a minute. So I'm starting to get into it and realized I shouldn't. So you avoid a lot of this sort of thing by vetting your designs, especially if they have radical change in them, like the touch screen issue in the fighter jets. You do prototyping and usability testing. Another technique I talk about a lot in my design classes is producing multiple designs, allowing them to be compared, letting them compete against one another. That's a powerful technique to make sure that you have an optimal design. Now, this isn't easy. Think about the fighter pilot thing. If they'd gone to the fighter pilots and said, okay, we're going to put these touch screens in, well, the fighter pilots would have said, no, we really prefer our tactile switches. Well, how do you know if they're saying that because it's right, which it did turn out to be, or just because they're attached to the past, to the way they're used to? That is a very tricky thing. Users tend to like what they're familiar with, even if it's not very good, because they've already learned it. That's called status quo bias. And the way to deal with status quo bias is to up your design to be even bolder, but also to verify and vet that the new thing is preferred by the users. And I have stories I can tell you there of design projects where they had tried and the users kept rejecting, preferring the old system, and then a well-designed from scratch system that matched their job was immediately adopted. The resistance went away because the new design fit their job and was so appealing to them. So it can be done. It's hard. Let's be honest about that. But just giving up and copying old stuff because the users are uncomfortable with new stuff is not good. Then there are various bad design approaches that I lump under the category of design theater, meaning we think or pretend that we are doing design when we're really not. And one of them is asking for feedback, but tipping off the user about the feedback you want, which that's what the Windows 8 team, remember, the clever Hans effect. So when you go for feedback, you need to take measures to make sure it's honest and useful. One of the ways to do that is that multiple design approach that I mentioned earlier. Suppose you take one design of some new piece of your app to users and say, what do you think? And it breaks down into, well, I think that the colors aren't good, and we should switch the order of these fields. And okay, how many of you have been in that meeting? Yeah. We call that a food fight in English. Is that, you know that phrase? Why did they do that? Well, because you asked for help, but you didn't give them any good mechanism to give you help, because all they can do is either fiddle with it or say, this is horrible, start over. And most people won't do that. They called your baby ugly if they do that. So they won't. Instead, if you do multiple designs and you put those designs in front of them and now they're comparing, which design fits my job better? And they're engaged with your ideas and your designs at a much higher level. They're expending a lot more cognitive cycles to figure out which one's better and why. In many cases, well, I like this one overall, but that one thing over there, could you find a way to integrate that into here? See, that's the kind of feedback that you want. And having multiple designs is one good way to do it. But unfortunately, sometimes even we get into this build and then get feedback. I'm going to talk about that in a minute in detail because it's design theater, really. It's not leveraging design. It's just getting to a point where the pain slightly goes away. Designing from assumptions without making sure that those assumptions apply. I've got some stuff on that. And then there's people. Have you ever had an executive come in that pretty obviously was an imposter and couldn't really carry out their job, but they covered that up with buzzwords and such? Oh yes, we are good at design. We are user-centric. They knew all the buzzwords, but they didn't really know how to do anything or make any constructive change. That's common. Designing by implementing backlog items. Granular design has its place, and every project's going to have some, but granular design means that there is no incentive or encouragement to step back and take a bigger picture of how does this fit into the design of the entire application. How do these four things fit together? Are there commonalities and such? So designing off a backlog has some is not really design, except in a very narrow sense of doing that small piece. And then assuming that design just means making it pretty is another design theater approach. The users don't know what they want. We have to build something and show it to them. I'm indebted to the father of Visual Basic, which means he's the grandfather of Visual Studio, more or less, Alan Cooper. I was watching him in a session at Microsoft. I was speaking right after him, so I was watching him, and he said that that's just an absolute cop-out. What basically these people are saying is, I don't know how to talk to users and draw out of them enough about their jobs and what they need to design for it. It is true that users cannot design screens. That is not and should not be a part of what they do. But it is certainly possible to draw information about their jobs and their workflow out of them to do design. I know it's possible because I've been doing it since the mid-90s in my Visual Basic projects back then. So it is possible, but it's a skill. Understanding what questions to ask. When I teach my design classes, I give people a list of questions to ask users and some guidelines for how you analyze what they told you. It's a skill, and some people can develop it. Now, it's certainly true that some developers are kind of enough different psychologically from the user population that they do have difficulty building the communication to do it. So some developers aren't suited for this. But in my experience, most developers are. Yeah, so that's good. So, but again, people don't do this as much as they should because they'd really rather be writing code. In fact, I've often discussed this problem of affinity for code in terms of substance abuse. Right? I mean, you've got code heads versus coke heads. That's only one letter difference, and both of them do lines to get their fix. And some of you probably suffer from this addiction. If you're in a meeting that's supposed to take 90 minutes to discuss some functionality that you have to implement, and 10 minutes later, you're not listening anymore, you're coding the solution in your head, or even worse, on your laptop on the conference table. Okay, you understand that that's the sign of an addiction. You should be listening. Listening is another skill you should work on to do good design. And you should be able to put that aside for the 90 minutes to gain the level of understanding you need about what you're going to do. Now, but as I said, it's kind of an addiction. Developers don't like to put it aside for other things, even for small amounts of time. And the things I'm talking about never grow to be more than 10 or 15% typically of a developer's job. But boy, they resist spending that 10% on not coding. And one of the excuses they often use is, well, you know, I'm a developer. I'm no good at stuff like that. Developers often have a mental image of what a designer is that is false. And I've metaphorically shown it with this picture, which I took. I saw this flock of flamingos at if you ever go to Florida, there's a wildlife park called Homosassa Springs Wildlife Park. I took this picture there. Developers think about the designers as colorful creatures that are totally different from the turkey vultures that represent non-designers, developers, managers, etc. So that you can do it, but it's a skill that you have to develop. And as I said, the one of the other excuses that they use is, well, the users don't know, we have to build and get feedback. The most common way I hear this is, we must rapidly build the MVP, and then we will iterate and refine it to a good design. I have never seen that work to get a good design. Because what happens is, you iterate until people don't hate it so much that they're bitching about it all the time. And then you stop. You don't iterate to a great design, and besides, it's very hard to get to a great design. Great design is big picture. You have to pull back to the big picture. And people who have done this and then call me, could you come in and help us with our design? Yes, let's start over and do it right. And that's not the answer they want to hear, so those people usually don't take me. Now, and as I said, look, I understand the whole MVP thing. I do. Software gets harder to develop every year. And everybody's always pushing us to get it done faster. And the entire MVP, minimum viable product, for those of you who might not be familiar, that whole thing was in response to this drive for greater speed. And I understand it. But here's the thing. A lightweight design phase, if you know what you're doing, doesn't take that long and saves so much time later that you don't lengthen the development project. You just get a higher value end product. But design expertise is sufficiently limited that in the industry that we don't really see that. How much longer have I got? 10 minutes? 12? I want some variation. 12, okay. I have to pace my last few slides to fit the time. Then I talked about designing from assumptions. This was one of the mistakes the Windows 8 team made. Remember, going up against the iPad. So they did some user research around iPad users. And one of the key findings was that the typical iPad tablet user does not understand the concept of a file hierarchy or a folder hierarchy. As in, they just don't get it. And you know people like that. Their desktop is one big, giant expanse of icons. Now, I understand that there are people like that. And out of that, Microsoft took the watch phrase, folders are where apps go to die. So they didn't put any folders in their main interface for Windows 8. But the problem they were up against is that's a bad assumption for the typical Windows user. And if you're going to push this on them, you better take them into account as well as these new people you're going after. I need to do a distracted boyfriend meme from Microsoft, going after the iPad users and leaving the Windows users behind, don't I? That just occurred to me right here on stage. So they got that wrong because they don't realize that iPad users normally are doing just consumption of stuff. Very light production of things like emails. Mostly consumption. Whereas, in the Windows world, we do work. real work. And I would hear, I hear people say when the iPad came out, oh, my grandmother loves her iPad. And my response was something like, yes, and my 3-year-old loves his speak and spell too, but neither of them have any work to get done. And so if you're going to aim windows, you got to aim it at people who are going to do work. So that was a mistake, assuming something from user research that wasn't correct. I mentioned this one in my list, that managers are especially vulnerable to this. And one of the reasons why is that well-designed apps tend to have good aesthetics. Good aesthetics is a proxy for good design to create a good first impression so that you give the design a chance. But just as men will tell you when they have a weakness for beautiful women, they'll give a beautiful woman a chance over a woman who is not so attractive. But that chance wears out pretty quickly if that person has an awful personality. So aesthetics will only get you so far. The first impression is important, and aesthetics will do that. But you can't use aesthetics to cover up a bad design. The underneath is still there and is still pretty much the same that it always was. In fact, aesthetics is only one level of design effort. Visual design overall is important and adds value. Nobody wants to use an ugly app or an ugly website. That's certainly true. But there's a limit to how much value and innovation you can do with just layout and aesthetics. There are multiple ways that you can increase the level of design effort. You can aim, for example, a design project, a small, constrained design project at a piece of an existing app, a view that people use all the time, a lot. You might do a new design for it to speed up the workflow in it, or speed up or get better data visualization in it. So a small piece of an app that's already there because you can't afford to replace the entire application. Okay, so that's a level of design above aesthetics, and it was going to generate more value. Beyond that, you might have to replace an entire application, most commonly because you're changing platforms. In which case, why wouldn't you want to do a good design and get maximum value and maximum shelf life out of it? Now, that's called interaction design. That term was coined by Alan Cooper. And that means the navigation between different views and the overall consistency and capability to handle the workflows that the user has in a proper way. I talked about the president of the company with the page flipping animation. One of the things we did there when we completely replaced their app was some surveys to find out when somebody is on the phone and you bring up the inquiry screen for a customer, what are the 3 things you expect to need to do? And we compiled a list out of that of 5 from the surveys of everybody. And the view that you get when you go into the customer inquiry and select a customer is that view, which has the most relevant data for the main things that people expect to do. And users were crazy about that. Let me tell you, they left their old app behind in a hurry because that speeded them up, helped them avoid mistakes, and the end user worked in a propane shop. Think Hank in King of the Hill, if you've seen that. So their concern was to keep their customers happy, and that design helped them do that. So overall interaction design is the next step up. Sometimes, this is rare, I've only done this about half a dozen times in the last 12 years because these are long projects. You do a complete rethinking of a workflow across a large organization that involves various aspects and maybe multiple applications. Now, we've done, one of the ones I did for that in 2004, cut the labor needs for their process in half. That's the kind of impact you can have from projects like that. So you get more and more value as you go up the scale, and you should understand kind of where your project fits. And as you get into the bigger projects, it's more investment, more people are involved, takes longer, but the returns go up. So you need to kind of understand where you are in that spectrum in order to invest the right amount and have the right and set the right level of expectations and get above just the aesthetic version. Oops, I always forget that I have the arrows to point at those as I talk to them. And if you want to see some of the payback as for interaction design and the next level up, I have a spreadsheet that you can look at for that does some calculations for corporate apps particularly. And you're welcome to look at that if you like and put in your own numbers and see what you think. So let's summarize our bad design approaches. Doing no design at all, that's the Hawaii people, right? Copying a design without consideration for whether it fits, that's where 3M went wrong. Designing for the convenience of the development team, users don't know what they want. Well, yeah, but you can find out. Wouldn't it be cool if, boy, the the F-35 people had that in spades, and so did Windows 8. And various forms of design theater. Contaminating your feedback by tipping off what you want, build and then get feedback. And assuming design equals good aesthetics, which it does not. It's much bigger than that. So you can do design practices that are more durable and effective. One of the nice things about learning some of these skills and some of these techniques is that they will stay with you as technology changes. We talk in America about building a talent stack that you know how to do various things well. You have a focus, but you can do other things well too, and that increases your value to your organizations, which hopefully eventually returns to you in the form of more money and more respect. So learning some of these things how to do these things will stick with you. Being able to learn how to work with users and focus on them. Don't focus on the technology or your convenience first. Focus on the users first. There's a time to get to the technology, but it's not at the beginning. And really learn to listen to them. You can go out and do some research. There are exercises to learn how to listen better. Do you know what the average amount of time for the average human being is when they're engaged in a conversation before their mind wanders as they're listening to someone? 2 minutes. It's less than 30 seconds. Now, you can sometimes bring it back, but you can do exercises to get that up to several minutes. Just as an example of what you can do to learn to listen. Keep asking questions. Keep testing assumptions. I've got time to tell this story just barely, since we're kind of at the last slide. I was at a client, and a group called me in for a little mini design consultation. They had an app where they wanted the operator, of which there were several hundred, to ask particular questions. But the questions varied depending upon things about the particular person they're talking to. So what they wanted to do, they'd caught the data visualization bug. And so they wanted to put data visualizations to tip the user off about various things so that the user would make the right decision about what question to ask the person they were talking to. And so we spent about 30 minutes on what these things were doing and what they were trying to communicate. And then this didn't feel right to me, and after a while I realized why. I asked them the question, do you have an algorithm that will come up with the question you want them to ask? And they thought, yeah. Can you program that? Yeah. Well, why don't you just tell the user the question you want them to ask? The team had and the look on the face when you ask a question like this, it's just amazing. They'd never thought of that. Keep asking questions. Keep testing assumptions. Create multiple designs for every challenge. Do very deep and comprehensive evaluation to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And focus on the things that drive returns. By the way, you can get a session to talk to me about that. I do web sessions for people for free, 2 or 3 a month, that I'll talk about your business and sort of suggest some directions you can go in. And I try to find out about your business so I know where the returns will be. That's kind of my focus when I do that. So you can contact me if you'd like to do that. Also, if you want to understand a little bit about design principles, you can, I have a Pluralsight course on that. All right, we have time for a question, maybe one question, maybe? Because we're going to lunch next, aren't we? Anybody got any burning questions? You can always come to me afterwards. Now you're all hungry. Nobody's got burning questions. All right. Well, I hope this was helpful and maybe stimulated some ideas for you. Balance out some of the code-intensive sessions that you're no doubt going to see the rest of the week. Thank you all for being here, and come up and ask questions if you'd like to.